New from K-Tel Records, 22 explosive hits.
8 to 10 years ago, I wrote a blog post and I basically laid out Elvis's career in 7 different phases. Instead of making you read that blog post, why don't I read it for you? And I created maybe an audiobook of sorts, and it's only about maybe 10 minutes from beginning to end, but I decided to break it up into 2 parts. Phase 1, The King of Rockabilly, 1953 to 55. From his very first recordings in 1953 until he signed with RCA Records, Elvis was primarily known as a country and hillbilly performer, a genre that is now commonly referred to as rockabilly. His sides for Sun Records are legendary and are now acknowledged as early rock and roll, but when he was signed to the label, he was sold as a hillbilly artist, and he was quite successful at it too. During the first year or 2 of his professional career, this wiggling slab of talent honed his skills on the road, building up a fan base and receiving plenty of attention from the press. This may have been before he hit the big time, but this period was crucial in turning Elvis into the artist that he became when worldwide fame came calling. When RCA bought his contract from Sun Records, his style didn't change that much, but the production on Elvis's records moved away from the raw, rootsy feel of the Sun sessions towards a more refined but no less energetic sound. This slight shift in direction earned him his legit nickname. Phase 2, The King of Rock and Roll, 1956 to 59. Beginning with his first RCA single, Heartbreak Hotel, in January of 1956, Elvis went from being an up-and-coming hillbilly country artist to rock and roll's first real superstar. When people refer to him being the king of rock and roll, this is the period they're talking about. It was a period that lasted a little less than 5 years, but it changed the course of music. I mean, everyone knows Hound Dog, Don't Be Cruel, Blue Suede Shoes, etc. And although he never toured overseas, his records were enormous hits in every corner of the world. Elvis was unique. Elvis was different. The kids loved his look and sound, but the adults found him offensive, just as it should be in rock and roll. However, Elvis was humble and down to earth, and that came through during his TV performances, which caught the attention of viewers of all ages. Whether he was loved or hated didn't matter. He was selling records and influencing a new generation. He made some movies, Love Me Tender, Loving You, Jailhouse Rock, and King Creole, and was drafted into the U.S. Army and spent the last 2 years of the decade overseas in Germany, yet his popularity never waned. Elvis seemed unstoppable. Phase 3, The Homecoming King, 1960. When Elvis was discharged from the Army in 1960, he received a hero's welcome. The press went wild. Frank Sinatra hosted a TV special in his honor, and he was thrust back into the studio to pick up where he left off. Plans were also put in place to resume his movie career. However, something was different. While Elvis had been away in Germany, rock and roll had become an accepted form of musical expression, so he was no longer considered dangerous or controversial. And in those 2 years, Elvis had lost his mother and had matured, leaving his primal rock and roll instincts behind and embracing a sound that was deeper and more meaningful to him. Yes, it was still rock and roll, but it was more controlled, more thoughtful, and more emotional. He was singing better than ever, and the gospel and country that he loved growing up began informing the music that he made. Elvis shaped a new sound for himself and set his sights on growing as an artist, as an actor, and as a human being. Phase 4, King of the B-Movie Musicals, 1961 to 67. Elvis made 2 films in 1960 alongside his Elvis Is Back album, but it wasn't until 61 that his focus shifted away from the studio and onto the silver screen. That year, Blue Hawaii was released, and it was a turning point for Elvis. The hit movie helped the soundtrack shift millions of units around the world and convinced everyone that his movies were better at promoting his albums than his concert tours were. So apart from one benefit show, Elvis did not play in front of a live audience again until 1968. In the meantime, he recorded a lot of soundtrack music, made a lot of movies, and sporadically recorded non-soundtrack sides that would be released between films. This was the period of time that most critics consider his first downfall. The truth is, a lot of the soundtrack recordings were lightweight and often embarrassing, but Elvis always made it sound great. It was obvious at times that his heart was not in it, and he may have seemed like he was sleepwalking through many of the songs, but there are some absolute gems that made it all worthwhile. A lot of people forget that Return to Sender and Can't Help Falling in Love, two of his most familiar 60s hits, were from soundtracks. Other top-notch tunes include Come On Everybody, I Got Lucky, I'll Take Love, Viva Las Vegas, King of the Whole Wide World, many more. They may not have been on the same level as his 50s hits, but they were recorded under different circumstances and in a very different time. There are real gems to be found during this phase in his career, although you do have to have a little bit of patience and get past songs like Do the Vega and Old MacDonald. Remember this, though. Elvis cut some amazing non-soundtrack recordings during this time, and the power in those cannot be denied. But alas, the studio became his part-time job, and movies became his full-time job. Phase 5, The King of Comebacks, 1968 to 71. By the end of '67, record and movie ticket sales had dropped, and Elvis was no longer embraced by the music industry. His movies were fun but formulaic, just like the music. He started putting more energy into his non-soundtrack recordings, and while they weren't scaling the charts, he was sounding more connected to the music than he had since 1960. Since there was no interest in his movies or records at this point, Colonel Parker decided it was time that he returned to the medium that helped create the legend a decade before, television. The 1968 Elvis TV special is now called the 68 Comeback Special for a reason. It rejuvenated his career in a big way. The TV special showcased an artist with a fire in his belly that seemed to have been missing for years. With a new look, Elvis blew everyone away with a variety of songs old and new. With much of it filmed in front of a live audience, Elvis was filled with nervous energy. It was a stunning return to form. Suddenly, everyone who saw it was an Elvis fan again. He still had a few movies left on his contract, so he filmed those while focusing more on studio work into 1969. His sessions in Memphis are now legendary, and they gave him some of the most memorable hits of his career: Suspicious Minds, In the Ghetto, Kentucky Rain, and more. Elvis never sounded more connected with the music. There was a rasp in his voice that came from the soul, and every word he sang sounded like the gospel. Not only did he return to TV and studio, he also made his return to live performing. Those first 1969 shows in Las Vegas are now legendary. When he returned to Vegas in '70, his engagements were filmed for the movie That's the Way It Is. On top of the Vegas gigs, he began touring the U.S. again. To top it all off, he returned to the studio, and although not as groundbreaking as the '69 recordings, his studio work still sounded like he was connecting to his music again. Elvis had never been more alive, more real, and more in touch with himself and his audience. The excitement lasted throughout '71 before more changes began taking place. Phase 6, The King of Entertainers, 1972 to '77. Next to the soundtrack recordings, his '70s output is the most misunderstood phase in Elvis's career. Although this period started out well, Burning Love and Always on My Mind are two of his greatest singles, things went slightly askew commercially. Record buyers wanted more rock and roll from Elvis, but he seemed more interested in entertaining than rocking. His choice of live material included recent pop hits alongside songs he was best known for. In fact, his live set lists began to feature the same type of material that adult contemporary artists like Andy Williams and Perry Como would include in their own concert performances. His recorded output began to suffer as well. While most artists went into the studio to record an album, Elvis headed in to record as many songs as possible in a short period of time. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, and RCA Records would then take those songs and spread them out over a few albums, plus a couple of non-album singles. During this period, Elvis seemed to put his heart and soul in the type of songs he really connected with: the ballads, the country songs, and the gospel favorites. Elvis's voice still sounded great, but he wasn't always offered the greatest material due to publishing issues that you can read about elsewhere. However, when Elvis did actually connect with the material, he made the songs his own. Every one of his 70s albums contained classic songs and performances, although there are some tracks that are best left only heard once. However, he was still an extremely popular artist, and his Madison Square Garden concert in '72 and the Aloha from Hawaii satellite broadcasts were two of the most celebrated highlights of his career, although I kind of consider his performance on Aloha to be uncharacteristically reserved. Behind the scenes, things were changing. Rock radio stopped playing his singles around '73, although he was still being played on country radio stations. In '75, he seems to have regained some of his energy on the Today album, but by this time, the momentum was slowing down. From that point, Elvis couldn't be bothered to enter a studio anymore. His final two albums, From Elvis Presley Boulevard and Moody Blue, were recorded at Graceland in his jungle room. And a dependence on prescription drugs and a never-ending tour cycle wore Elvis down. On August 16, 1977, it all came to an end. He was only 42. Phase 7, the king of the whole wide world. In Elvis's final years, he couldn't get a record into the pop or rock charts. Concert attendance was still good, but record sales were dwindling. However, when he died, sales on Elvis's catalog went through the roof. Entire record pressing plants had to set aside other projects in order to keep up with the demand for Elvis's albums. Elvis probably sold more records than any other artist in the world over the next year or two. And over the years, Elvis has released more albums posthumously than he did when he was alive. As long as there is interest in his music, there will always be reissues and repackages. In fact, the official Elvis Collector's label, Follow That Dream, has released amazing digitally remastered and expanded editions of all of his studio albums and soundtracks, as well as loads of previously unreleased live shows. There's never been a more exciting time to delve deep into his catalog than now. There is so much great music to be explored. The king is dead. Long live Elvis.